Today, we're really getting into some big shifts happening in the global economy. And we're doing it through the eyes of someone with quite a unique perspective. Hsien Loong, Singapore's senior minister, formerly prime minister. He's talked about something he calls the world temporarily minus one. That phrase alone, it just makes you stop and think, right, how is global trade changing when the big players, well, they start moving differently? So our mission here is to unpack what Lee actually means by that. We'll look at the sort of fundamental economic forces he talks about, and crucially, what does this all mean in the real world? For countries, for trade, maybe even for you.
Exactly. And we're basing this on some really insightful clips from a video featuring Hsien Loong. I mean, this is someone who's spent decades at the heart of these discussions, a real statesman's view. It's a pretty valuable chance to hear directly from, someone who's been in the room where it happens.
Definitely. Okay, so let's kick things off with that phrase, the world temporarily minus one. What's he really getting at? What does it tell us about where the global economic framework stands right now?
Well, according to Lee, it paints a picture where, look, the basic plumbing of global trade, that framework, it's mostly still there. But America, which has historically been, a central pillar, it's temporarily not quite participating in that fully open, multilateral way we perhaps got used to.
Temporarily not participating.
Right. Now, he's clear, America still needs to trade. They need rare earths. They need goods from everywhere. It's not isolation. It's more about a shift in their strategic approach to trade relationships.
Okay.
And that word temporary, that's really important. It seems to reflect Lee's hope, maybe his strategic assessment, that the U.S. might down the line shift back towards a more open, multilateral stance. So he's not necessarily seeing this as the permanent state of affairs. At least that's the hope expressed.
Right. And that ties into what we've seen, doesn't it? The U.S. moving towards a more, what did Lee call it? A narrow bilateral transactional view, sort of stepping back a bit from the big WTO system approach. What happens when an economy that huge changes, pack like that? What are the ripples?
Well, Lee points out that, most other countries are still trying to work within that WTO framework. It's definitely not perfect, we all know that, but it still allows for a huge amount of trade relatively freely. But when a major player like the U.S. signals it's not fully on board with parts of it or wants to do things differently, well, yeah, there are consequences. You can't avoid them. He kind of describes it as a situation that's still unfolding, still shaking out, but the effects are absolutely being felt globally.
Okay.
And this leads us to something really profound Lee observed. He said, you can fail to follow an economic principle, but you cannot repeal an economic law. That distinction, it's critical.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Principles versus laws.
Right. So economic principles, think of them as guidelines, maybe ideals. Governments can choose to ignore them, and sometimes they do for political reasons or whatever. But economic laws, these are more like fundamental truths about how markets work, how people and countries behave economically. They just operate, whether you like it or not, whether you acknowledge them or not.
That is a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
So these laws, Lee suggests, they're rooted in basic market forces, incentives, people acting in their self-interest. He described them as very powerful and very difficult to just chop off. It sounds almost like, I don't know, fighting the tide.
Exactly. You can build a seawall, maybe divert it for a bit, but the underlying force is still there. And he gives these great examples of the consequences. If you try to block something here, he says, close here, it pops up somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or you close there and whoops, it pops up somewhere else again.
Okay.
So you might think you're solving one problem, but then you get these unintended side effects cropping up elsewhere. He calls it chasing your tail.
Right.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. You poke the system in one place and it ripples right through.
So if governments try to use policies, like, say, tariffs, to kind of override these fundamental laws, are they just setting themselves up for this endless game of whack-a-mole, trying to squash the consequences?
In many ways, yeah, that seems to be the picture he paints. The immediate impact of something like tariffs is often pretty clear. You get complaints straight away. Lee mentions, for instance, businesses needing steel suddenly finding prices have shot up. Or chip makers who suddenly can't sell easily to China, or maybe can't get components they need from Taiwan. Those are the direct hits, the disruption.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's what I found really interesting in what Lee was saying. He observed that once these tariffs are in place, they become, quote, politically not possible to take back, even if a new government comes in with maybe a different view. Why is that? What makes them so sticky?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It's down to the fact that the tariffs themselves start to change the landscape. They create, as Lee puts it, new players and businesses with vested interests. Suddenly, there are companies, maybe whole sectors, that actually benefit from that protection. They depend on it.
Oh, okay.
So if you then try to remove the tariff, those groups who've adapted and are now thriving because of it, they'll fight hard to keep it. They'll lobby, they'll protest. And politically, it's also a bit of a trap. A new leader removing tariffs might get accused of, giving away something valuable, weakening the country's stance, even if economists say it's better overall.
Right, they look weak or like they're undoing something meant to protect jobs.
Exactly. And Lee gave some pretty stark examples. He pointed out that when President Biden took over from President Trump, those tariffs on China weren't removed. In fact, Lee noted, Biden actually tightened his screws on China more. Yeah. And he even mentions seeing a debate moment where Trump pointed out that tariffs he'd put in place years before were still there under Biden. It really undermines the idea that these are just temporary measures you can easily switch on and off.
Yeah, that's a really significant observation for anyone trying to figure out where things are heading. So if these trade policy shifts, especially tariffs, are so darn hard to reverse, what does that mean for, say, businesses trying to plan? Or for countries trying to find some stability, this unpredictability?
Well, it means, as Lee puts it, that the old idea of comparative advantage, countries specializing in what they do best, it's not dead, but it is evolving. The fundamental economic logic hasn't gone away, but the rules of the game, the environment, it's changed. Countries, especially ones like Singapore that are really plugged into global trade, they have to adapt to this new reality, this world temporarily -1. The old playbook just doesn't fully apply anymore.
Okay, so if the playbook needs updating, what are the new plays? What concrete steps can countries take to navigate this, especially in this -1 world?
Lee lays out a few key strategies. First off, make friends. Strengthen ties with like-minded partners. That could be within existing regional groups, he mentions ASEAN specifically, or broader agreements like the RCEP, or even plurilateral deals like the CPTPP, bringing together economies that complement each other. The idea is to build stronger networks that can keep trade flowing, even if the global picture is messy.
Build resilience through partnerships. Makes sense.
Second, he says, don't give up on the WTO. Even if it's struggling with consensus, like-minded countries should keep working within it. Try to find ways to make it function better, maybe move forward on specific issues, even without everyone on board, to get past that consensus gridlock. His phrase was something like trying to make the multilateral framework less bad rather than write it off entirely. So incremental progress where possible.
Okay, keep working the system.
And third, and this is really crucial, diversification. Actively look for new markets, new sources. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. He specifically mentioned exploring unexplored markets. For Singapore, that might mean looking more towards Latin America, a region they haven't historically focused on as much. And he also pointed to the huge potential and diversity of the African continent, 50-plus countries, he emphasized. Not all are the same, but some offer really promising opportunities.
Spreading the risk, finding new growth areas.
Exactly. It's about building options and reducing dependency on any single market or supplier that might become politically unstable or inaccessible.
These are really practical strategies. So thinking about our listeners, maybe you're running a business, maybe you're involved in policy, or maybe you're just trying to understand the news. What's the big takeaway here? How do these ideas apply?
Well, I think it boils down to Hsien Loong's final, really sobering point. He said, however much we like economic principles to apply and how much we worship economics, the reality is we are always limited by geopolitical constraints. It's a reminder that decisions, especially at the national level, aren't just made on spreadsheets calculating maximum economic efficiency. Politics, security, national interest. These factors inevitably play a huge role.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? How those political realities can sometimes just override what seems like the most logical economic path. Efficiency isn't always the top priority.
Precisely. And he grounded it in Singapore's own experience. He mentioned their free trade agreement with the U.S., which historically meant 0% tariffs on American goods coming into Singapore, a really open relationship. But now, because of shifts in U.S. policy aimed elsewhere, Singapore finds itself facing a 10% tariff, just like many others.
Even with that strong history.
Right. And while Lee kind of wryly noted that maybe this 10% is still the best rate they can get under the circumstances, he explicitly questioned whether things are really better than we were before. It's a really clear example of how geopolitics can reshape even long-standing, mutually beneficial economic arrangements.
Wow. This has been a really insightful deep dive. We've covered so much ground. From unpacking Hsien Loong's idea of the world temporarily minus one to that crucial distinction between economic principles you can ignore and economic laws you absolutely cannot repeal. Then the whole issue of why policies like tariffs become so entrenched, so sticky. And finally, the practical strategies nations are using to adapt diversification, strengthening partnerships, trying to keep multilateralism alive. It really feels like a world in flux.
It definitely is. And it leaves you with a pretty big question, doesn't it? If these geopolitical constraints are always going to shape, and sometimes maybe even trump, pure economic logic, then what actually defines a country's success and stability going forward? And maybe more importantly, what role can individual countries play? Can they actively work to shape that multilateral framework, make it, as Lee said, less bad, rather than just accepting its decline?